So I will, maybe in a couple minutes, I will introduce Dr. Ezra Gayawan, and then he will introduce the actual organizer and, the chair of today's session. Dr. Ezra has organized today's session. I hope everybody is doing well. Arvind, how are things in India regarding COVID? Yeah, so today we have it's our final LISA 2020 symposium event, and just a little bit of background. So LISA 2020 is a global network of statistics and data science collaboration laboratories, and we originally had in mind a face-to-face symposium in Boulder, Colorado, in October of last year, and due to travel restrictions, et cetera, we're not able to make it a face-to-face symposium event. And so instead, we turned it into an online event. And instead of having 8 hours of Zoom every single day for several days, and that wouldn't have worked with time zone differences either. We decided to spread out the LISA 2020 symposium into plenary events that are every month, and then also some locally and regionally organized events. And so those regional events and local events happened last year, and had many people face to face. And these plenary sessions have been occurring since October, and today is our last one, and it is about COVID-19 and statistical approaches with COVID, and especially in lower middle income countries. So I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Gayawan, and then he will introduce the chair of today's session. So Ezra, please. Oh, and Ezra is from FUTA, from the Federal University of Technology, Akure in Nigeria. And Ezra, go ahead and take over.
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome everyone to our season on the COVID-19, and I hope that you are going to enjoy the presentations. The presentation is going to be chaired by Dr. Oyelola Adegoye, who is from the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine. So he's going to introduce the rest of us that will be making the presentation. So Dr. Adegoye, I hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Ezra. The pleasure is mine for joining this section. I've been following this section for a while now. I have to thank Ezra for inviting me to contribute to the chapter. So this, the last presentation here is a collaboration between 4 researchers. So when Dr. Ezra invited us to contribute, we came together from the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine of King's University in North Queensland. And I will share my slides just before I introduce the presenter. Okay. I hope everyone can hear me and see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so we'll be talking on COVID pandemic in middle income countries. So the presenter will be myself. I'm a clinical research biostatistician and also a lecturer at the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine of James Cook University in North Queensland, Australia. Also, the presentation, I will just introduce the presenter. I will discuss some of the global dynamics early global dynamics of COVID-19. Then the second presentation will be by Dr. Ezra Gayawan, who will present on some approaches to disease mapping with application to COVID data. So Ezra Gayawan is a senior lecturer at the Department of Statistics for the University of Technology at Wuhan. And his research interest is in the area of biostatistics and spatial statistics. He has published extensively in this area and is the coordinator of FUTA USA. The second presentation will be from Dr. Adishna Adepole. Adishna is a mathematical modeler and infectious disease expert at the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine. So you'll be talking about mathematical model of SARS-CoV-2 dynamics. And the fourth presenter is Dr. Anto Park. Anto is a research fellow in economics and data science at the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine. So his research area in the area of economics and public health. So now the first question I want to ask is, did we see the current pandemic coming? So if you have most researchers, they will say yes. So almost all scientists agree that we have seen this coming based on the One Earth approach. So what do I mean by One Earth approach? One Earth is when it's a bridge between human health, animal health, and the environment, and how these are interlinked. So over the last few decades, it has been a very popular approach, and it's gaining a trend now. So the key interaction here is to zoonotic disease emergence. So these are infectious diseases caused by pathogens that jump from animal to human, and sometimes to other animals. And the recent events have shown that we humans are vulnerable to zoonotic infectious diseases. So in a paper in 2017, Alan and colleagues used boosted regression tree models to predict the global relative risk of zoonotic emerging infectious diseases. And what they did was to use spatial location of previous emerging infectious disease since 1940 to 2008. So they used that to train their model after adjusting for reporting bias and some explanatory variables such as human population, population change, vegetation, domestic animal population, and so on. So what you see on slide 2 is just the outcome of that research, which shows that areas of tropical regions have higher risk of zoonotic emerging infectious disease events in the next few years. And this is just not all area of tropics, but tropical countries or regions that are experiencing land use changes or where they have a wildlife biodiversity is very hard. So based on this, I think it was May 2020, the WHO formed a group of scientists from WHO Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and some scientists from China to consult on how to probably find the origin of COVID-19. through a One Health approach. And the summary of this joint task was just that they have a series of likely source to extremely likely. So based on the diagram, you can see that the first schema they have was that this is the direct zoonotic transmission from animal, cat, pangolins to human. So the first part of the picture right here shows the first possible transmission route. And the second one is probably also saying that there's also an intermediate host. And the third one is through a cold chain, which is somewhere in the upper here. Yeah. That is also possible through a cold chain where contamination occurs through food transmission, food transportation. And the last one, which is highly unlikely, is through a laboratory incident. So in this case, most people will support the first schema. All right. So early in the transmission, as early as March, me and my colleagues, we run a mathematical model to predict early transmission dynamics. So what I'm showing here is just the first outbreak in each country, and probably a few more in as early as March. So the green here, the green line, so the transmission from China to most of the Asian countries and Australia, and also to the US. And the first transmission occurs in China. Then from there, it goes to Europe. So in the transmission to Africa and South America, the first transmission, the first set of transmission occurred from most likely from Italy and some from UK, but mostly from Italy. Then the transmission in the Middle East actually started from Iran. So most of the transmissions that occur in Middle East originated from the Iran epicenter. So in the same study, we try to link or find if there's any correlation between the distance between these countries and the days until the first outbreak. And you can see that those countries that are closer to China, which are the green area here, they are the ones that experienced the first infectious disease. I mean, the first COVID spread from China. And the orange parts are those that are close to Iran. So the cluster right here are countries close to Iran, which also the epicenter from Iran. And the blue line represents countries in Europe, and those countries that also got their first set of infection from Europe. Why the black countries are just some random infection stock, like the diamond princess and so on. All right, so the team is a collaborative effort, as I said earlier, which comprises of probably up to 31 researchers. But this chapter was organized by Dr. Ezra Gayawan, with support from myself, Dr. Adishina, and Dr. Antopa. And as you can see in the picture of collaborative results, we have people from Singapore that also joined some of these COVID wards, and Nigeria, Qatar, United States, and so on. So that is just my introduction to this presentation. I will now call on Dr. Ezra Gayawan to share his slide and give us some in-depth into some of the approaches to disease marking with application of COVID data. I will just employ everyone to just wait until the end of all the presentations so we can all have the question at once. You may either type the question directly or just unmute your speaker and talk that. All right, thank you. Over to you, Dr. Ezra.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be speaking on some approaches to, sorry, it's coming up here. Some approaches to disease mapping. Geographical locations are often important components of decision making because decisions are made targeted at specific people in specific location. So in that wise, dictating spatial clusters in diseases is becoming an important component in evidence-based response. So disease mapping now provides a visual representation of the geographical distribution of diseases, which can aid to determine the source of outbreak. Formally, I define disease mapping as a collection of statistical methods that utilize spatial settings and assume positive spatial correlation between observations, essentially borrowing information from neighboring areas than from those further apart in smoothing local rates towards local neighboring values. What we mean by this definition is that when we talk of disease mapping, is a collection of statistical methods that make use of spatial settings, spatial approaches that invokes correlation between observations that come from neighboring environments than for those that are further apart, because it is assumed that observations coming from neighboring environments are likely to be correlated. They are likely to have impact on each other than the ones coming from further places. So spatial, disease mapping now tries to use some statistical techniques in order to invoke this correlation based on this information and come up with local estimate for each geographical entity. The goal is to produce spatially smooth maps that display variation of diseases across different geographical locations, and then also to determine locations of potential maybe disease cluster in order to determine whether diseases are clustering or otherwise, and also to ascertain if clusters at different locations are due to magnitude of the outbreak or resulting from just random fluctuation in a disease count. So these are often the goal, the purpose of disease mapping. Now, there are different approaches that have been employed to map diseases. They can range from some simple mapping of observed disease rates. That is, you count the number of observations, the number of cases from each location and divide it by the probably population. So the number of observed cases per unit population. Once you take that for different locations, you can decide to use any of the software that can assist you in putting that information on map. And that is also a form of disease mapping. At the early outbreak of COVID-19, some people use this a lot to show us how the disease, was spreading along different geographical locations. Also, there can be mapping of a standardized incidence ratio. This one is the ratio of observed counts to the expected number of cases for each geographical location. This standardized incidence ratio, you have to compute the expected count for each location and then take the ratio to compute the incidence ratio for each location, and then that can also be plotted. And then there are Bayesian approaches, that's using Bayesian spatial models for the purpose of estimating. That's the one I defined just now, that invokes a correlation between observations of neighboring observation in order to produce smooth maps. And then there are other approaches also that makes use of data mining and web-based mapping approaches to generate maps of diseases or whatever you want to plot. But I'll dwell a little on Bayesian disease mapping. Now, models for count, because diseases often are, we count the number of cases for each location at a particular period of time. For instance, COVID now in Nigeria, in my country, for instance, we have 36 states with a federal capital territory. We can count the number of cases from inception for each of the states in Nigeria and then use that information for the basis of our modeling. So if you have some little knowledge of statistics, you know that when you have count observation, the basic approach is to use a Poisson model. So Poisson generalized linear model gives a framework for analyzing count observations. And now the framework allows one to invoke a random intercept, a random effect term to read. And that random intercept can now be extended to a spatial component using what we call the conditional autoregressive random effect. I'm going to explain a little about that as I produce. And then this approach was extended by Bayesian model, which is today known as a BYM model in a Bayesian spatial model. When you talk of BYM model, that is a model that extends the conditional autoregressive approach using a fully Bayesian method that is estimated via MCMC, that's Markov chain Monte Carlo, in the framework of a generalized linear model. Now, suppose we have disease count that is YI taking over different locations. That can be said to have a Poisson distribution, like I said, and that can be modeled through a Poisson generalized linear model. So in this case now, the UI, which is the unit, the geographical unit that is collected from an area, different geographical units, we assume to have a multivariate normal distribution with mean zero and the covariance, spatial covariance matrices. Because the spatial covariance matrix now, we have to invoke some correlation based on the neighborhood structure of the observation. Now, the formulation, the conditional autoregressive formulation that I earlier mentioned allows us to replace the multivariate Gaussian that is assumed on the, that I pointed out here, this multivariate spatial covariance with a conditional autoregressive prior, such that it will allow us to invoke the spatial component. Now, the prior is the prior mean can be taken as a weighted average for different location. In most cases, it is taken to be in this form. That's this Gaussian distribution, such that CII here, this is the that's the regressive model describing. CII here can be a user-defined spatial dependence parameters, which define which region J are neighbors to region I. Sorry, region J are neighbors to region I, and then there can be, or you can define it based on weights that define the influence of region J on a neighboring region, which is region I. And then tau cal here is taken as an hyperparameter, which is the precision of the normal distribution. In most cases, when diseases are counted, taking over a number of cases, there is a tendency to record a huge number of zeros due to non-occurrence in some places. For instance, now, in the case of rare diseases, when it breaks out, there are some locations that might not have recorded any events. So in that case, the observations used to feature a number of zeros. So in most cases, a zero-inflated model is often considered, which is in this form. And then in this form, where the log can just be linked into the expected, the log pi, which is the mean of the Poisson, it's just still a Poisson distribution, but an extended version of it in order to accommodate the excessive zero. Again, the mu here, the u here and the v are considered to be geographical random effects. That's the spatial random effect will be extended, to be modeled through conditional autoregressive prior, and then a VAC prior can be assigned to this beta. That's the beta are when you have other covariates, that is other information apart from just the geographical location, whatever information you have, and you want to incorporate it into the model, then that can be estimated using a normal, just the classical regression techniques that we know. Another approach is to use what we call a geoadditive model. In this case, you have yi, which is the count of cases. Then you have other information. For instance, now, this is often applicable when you have a survey situation where you collect information from an individual, and then you have other characteristics of the individual, let's say like age, like education, the wealth level, and so on. You have other information such that some of the information can be categorical in nature. For instance, education of the individual, wealth, social class of the individual. These are categorical variables. And then you can also have some metrical variables like the age of the individual. And you feel you want to model them in such that you can be able to understand the functional relation of each of those metrical covariates, and at the same time combine it with a spatial component, that's the geographical information, which is the SI, the geographical information of the place where the individual is coming from. So a model of this form can be used to link up all these different information in a modeling framework. There are a number of packages. Well, these are just the models. Then we'll now talk of how the estimation processes, which I will not be able to go into because of the shortness of time and the nature of this presentation. But there are packages that, software and packages that can be used to estimate Bayesian spatial models. I have listed some R packages here that are extremely useful, like R-INLA, which is fast gaining ground now. We have CarBayes and a number of them. Then there are some standalone software like BayesX and Winbug. There are quite others also that are extremely useful. So any of these can, and most of them come with manuals and information that make them user friendly, that anybody can study them and then use them. Then I'm going to talk on some application like the first, Dr. Adigbo stated, we have worked as a collaboration on, especially on this COVID since it started. So I'm going to present some of our collaborative work on Africa in order to demonstrate the application of some of these models I've earlier presented. So the one I'm going to be presenting first is based on Africa. The first case of COVID was recorded in Africa on 14th of February. I think that was in Egypt, then followed by Nigeria, something on 27th of February or so. So we collected data for 2 months, between 14th of February to 15th of April 2020, data for 47 countries. And then we also look at the health capacity of the countries, that is the number of bed spaces available and the number of physicians that are having. This is just a display of the number of cases. This aspect gives us the number of cases of COVID that were recorded as at 15th of April. Then this is the distribution of hospital beds available for each country, just to show their capacity in, to be able to face the challenge of COVID that was coming. Then this is the number of physicians from each country per 1,000 population. The distribution, as we can see here, that it is countries in the Northern Africa region that seems to have more physicians per 10,000 population than somewhere in South Africa, but the rest of Africa seems to be having some inadequate. And when it comes to bed spaces also, we have it there. Now, we did a spatiotemporal model. for the 2-month period.
That wind of change. However, I debate what if that change is going to occur.
A spatial-temporal modeling.
One cannot.
So we did a spatial-temporal modeling in which we took the data by weeks, but our first week was taken to be from a first month because of paucity of data at that period, from 14 February to 13 March. And then the other ones, we take them as 1 week period, 1 week interval. And then this is a map of week 1 now, which is the first month, the distribution of COVID in African countries based on a weekly interval from February 14th to 15th of April. And then next to it, we have, this is the map, the distribution of what I call now this structured and then the unstructured. This structured component, this structured map is the map that takes into account that invoke the correlation I was speaking of the other time, the spatial correlation between the number, the observation that is between the location that invokes, look at the nearness of the neighborhood structure of the countries in the estimation. That is what this A part of the map is showing. The second part, which is this B, is showing the unstructured, that is the one that was modeled without assuming a correlation among the countries. If you look at it, you discover that the one that doesn't assume any correlation seems to say that, oh, there are countries like South Africa and some countries in Northern Africa, Egypt, and I think this is probably Morocco also, were having high cases. But when the neighborhood structure were taken into account, you discover that countries in Western Africa and towards Northern Africa seems to be having some neighborhood effect in the spread of early dynamics of COVID in Africa. Then, well, the model we used for this study was a distributional one. We used a Hodel Poisson model that has two parameters, the mean, which is the result that I've earlier showed, to show the mean distribution, and also it has a parameter P that shows the probability of non-occurrence of the disease in Africa. So as at that time, still, this is the structured probability of non-occurrence. That is the likelihood that the event will not occur at that period. So this first map shows us that countries in the Southern Africa seems to have more likelihood of non-occurrence. And of course, if you compare it with the map I earlier showed of the distribution, you discover that most of Southern African countries, except South Africa itself, they were not recorded much cases as at this time. Then this is the unstructured, the one that does not invoke any correlation within the probability of non-occurrence. Then this is the temporal effects of COVID. This is the mean, that is, it shows that as the days are increasing, the chances of occurring, recording COVID-19 increases with time. However, the second one is the chances of non-occurrence, which shows that the probability that there will be no case of COVID at that time in Africa, that one reduces, tending towards negative. That is, there is a reduction in chances that there will be no occurrence of cases. And of course, that was true because at that time, there was record of cases COVID on a regular basis. The second example I will show briefly comes from Brazil. Though we use data as at 20th July. At that time, Brazil had recorded about almost 1.8 million cases and 77,000 deaths. So here we did a kind of mapping based on age group. I'm showing these two maps. This is the cases. The first one is the standardized incidence rate, like I was explaining the other time, is an approach that you can also adopt to map it. So this is the standardized incidence rate for age group from age 0 to up to greater than 80. Now, this is the one that comes from the model that assumes a spatial correlation among the the geographical locations. And then the next to it is another one that shows the mortality, that is the case, a death count. This is the standardized mortality rate, and this is now the smooth mortality from a spatial model. That's the cases from Brazil. So to conclude, disease mapping models allow for understanding of outbreaks at smaller geographical settings, and they provide some rich framework that allow for hierarchical spatial modeling. And one good thing about it is that the field has continued to generate a lot of interest due to emerging infectious diseases. Today we are talking of COVID. We don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. And when it happens, we don't pray for, but in case anything happens, then statisticians, mathematicians are going to be required to map, the cases as it continues. And as we are talking of emerging diseases, there are existing ones, malaria and so many other things, especially in most developing countries that have not abated. And all those ones also need to be looked into. That makes the area of spatial mapping, disease mapping, very, very interesting. For those that may pick up interest in this area of statistics, I've listed some books here that are extremely useful in this regard, and most of them are self-explanatory, that just with little background of statistics, you'll be able to get the concept. So I want to thank you all for listening. Over back to you, Dr. Adubu.
Oh, thank you so much. Wonderful question and wonderful presentation. Please just hold your questions to the end of all the 4 presenters, then you can have all your questions at the same time. Dr. Adekunle Additional, are you online now? Please? Can you share your slide and your thoughts?
Thank you, Dr. Oye, for the introduction, and Dr. Ezra for a wonderful tutorial on disease mapping. That is interesting. Yeah, I'm additional. I'm a research fellow, as Oye said, from the Australian Institute of Tropical Air and Medicine. And today I'll be talking and share my slides. Can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So I'll be talking on some mathematical models developed for SARS-CoV-2 in low and lower middle income countries. These models include the ones we develop ourselves and those developed by others. So a little bit about why we need to develop mathematical models. Each time you see outbreaks, different kind of models are being developed. We can talk about the 1918 Spanish flu, the Middle Eastern respiratory virus since 2012 and is still reoccurring, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, Zika, and now COVID-19. So the list goes on. But here, I'll be talking about models developed for COVID-19 and the rest. But before that, a little bit introduction into COVID-19. I guess COVID-19 is still ongoing, and there's need for us to still understand more about this and still get aware about the danger of getting this virus and the need to prevent ourselves. So COVID-19 is caused by SARS-CoV-2. First case identified in Wuhan, China in December 2019. And it thought to be started from animal. As Oye has said in One Earth, there is an interaction between human and animal in terms of disease spread. And as at now, 164 million cases has been reported with 4 million deaths. So you can get SARS-CoV-2 the same way as cold and flu, and this will be through droplets as we talk, cough, and sneeze. Also, some people develop symptoms while some do not. So these are the symptoms: fever, sore throat, shortness of breath. So if anyone is having these symptoms, it is very important to go for COVID-19 tests to see whether you are free. I have done 2 COVID-19 tests and I was lucky to be negative. So when you add the infection, the symptoms will show within 14 days for those that will develop symptoms. So when there's an outbreak, the pattern, the curve, the normal trajectory of the disease, we usually follow the gray pattern when there is no intervention implemented. But if there's an intervention, implemented, then the disease course will follow the yellow bar graphs here. So, and what leads to these interventions are different kinds of mathematical models developed to see what are the effects of implementing them. And it's not only mathematical model, other aspects of biology are also important. Like you want to understand the phylogenetics of the virus, you want to understand the transmission tree, because this is a new virus that we don't know much about. So you want to know what are the transmission rates, what are the behavioral parameters, what are the disease parameters. You want to understand everything. And this does not involve only mathematical models, it involves other aspects, other disciplines, and you need to understand more about the biology. So when COVID-19 started, we developed this mathematical model. This is a compartmental model with 6 compartments. The susceptible class, the early exposed class, the late exposed class, who are also infectious, the early infectious stage and the late infectious stage, and people recover, while some of them die from COVID-19. So this model has been modified, extended to see whether travel ban was effective in Australia, to determine whether the strategy implemented to combat COVID-19 in Nigeria is working. Also, the work done in Brazil to see how COVID-19 is spread in that community. So when you talk about different kind of mathematical model, it doesn't matter whether it's high income country or low or lower middle income countries. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is the ability to adjust for different factors that differentiate each country from another. For instance, in low income country, there are some factors that have challenges with the case being reported. For instance, a lot of underreporting, a lot of lack of facilities. So all these things have to be factored into the model to be able to understand the dynamic of a typical infectious disease in this country. So it doesn't, as I said, this model can be implemented in different forms. You can implement it as a deterministic form, where you look at the average number of cases that move from one compartment to another. Then you can use it in a stochastic form, when you look at the binomial number of cases that move from one compartment to another. And then you can treat individuals as entity on their own or as agent, and then you can see how the disease spread in the community. So one thing we do with this model is to look for the travel metrics. For this, in our work, we use the 2014 travel data that shows the number of people that flew from one country to another. And early on in the pandemic, you can use these travel metrics to see whether your country is at risk from another country. The red dot shows there is higher risk, while the green shows that the risk is it's fine, it's manageable. And so those are the way you can use mathematical model and data to inform whether your country is at risk when the outbreak happened in China in December, early December 2019 and early 2020. So we add this travel data into our mathematical model, and then we were able to predict the number of cases that have gone to different countries as of January 31, 2020. So you can see these countries include high-income countries, lower and middle-income countries. For instance, look at Cambodia. They reported just one case. We're able to see that the cases should be more than that. We were right on spot for Singapore estimates. And for some countries, we overestimate. For some countries, we underestimate. So these are the beauty of mathematics, to be able to see, predict what's happening with any kind of outbreak that is ongoing. So we later use this model again to see if there is shift in the epicenter. At the start of the outbreak, it was China. Later, it moved to Italy. And this is a highly computational intensive simulation where you have to adjust for every country. In this case, we used 200 countries, and we were able to show that when the epicenter moves to Italy, most European countries, as you can see, they are in trouble. And I guess our prediction were right, following what happened in those countries. So if you move from compartmental models, you move to statistical modeling and data feeding. So one thing we also did is to estimate the effective reproduction number. And to do this, we need to know the Poisson rate, the rate of infection, look at the total daily cases reported, and also look at the serial interval distribution. Serial interval distribution is a distribution of the time difference between infector and infectee. And so we put this into our Poisson distribution and do a Bayesian MCMC simulation to estimate the effective production in Nigeria and fit to the number of cases reported by the Nigerian government, by the Nigerian Disease Center. So you can see earlier on when Nigeria government introduced travel ban, the effective production number was about to go up. And when this crosses the one line ban, it means the disease will grow in the community. And so you want your R effective to be less than 1. And then at this point, within April, the R effective was below 1, showing little progress in the intervention measure. And by April 20, it crosses the 1 line mark and shows that the cases of COVID-19 could increase in Nigeria. So similar thing were done in Brazil to estimate the transmission rate and to see if the transmission rates were bigger than what was observed, the number of cases will have defeated to this. So these are different scenarios where compartmental model is being used combined with statistical modeling to estimate disease parameters. And same thing done in Ethiopia to estimate the number of susceptible infected, and these fitting were done using least square approach. In our case, we use Bayesian approach, and I know that you can also use maximum likelihood approach depending on your interest. So now the reigning thing about COVID-19 is fascination. And to understand fascination, you need to understand how the virus works in the body. And that leads me to within oscillating approach. And if you don't know what the virus does in our body, how our immune response, how our immunity is fighting this virus, then we can't really know whether the vaccine developed, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, whether they are going to be effective. So this group in Seattle developed a mathematical model of virus dynamics in an individual. And the beta is the rate of infection of the virus when they target cells, and then that leads to the formation of infected cell. And because you have infected cell in your body recognizes that, and the immune response starts to proliferate, in the late immune response into effector cells. And these effector cells try to clear all the, the effector cells try to clear all the infected cells from the system. And these are real data sets from individual. The S are the Singapore cases. The G are the German patients. The K is from Korea, and the E are from France. And then we can see when you get infected with SARS-CoV-2, the virus increases in number over time until they reach the peak. Because your immunity kicks in, the virus depreciates at an exponential rate until to get to a level whereby the virus is being cleared, or they stay at a lower level. For instance, in this patient X17, the virus is cleared, but in this T15, the virus continue at a very slow rate. So if you know how the virus, if you know the virus dynamic in the body, then you can combine that with what happens in the population. And this leads to another paper by this same author where they combine SARS-CoV-2 in us and ask us to see the implication of the viral load and your contact group. So for instance, this patient is infected and he has this contact network, but it can only transmit to just one person. And this is the viral profile of the patient and the viral profile of the new infected patient. So if you combine this, you can estimate how disease spread in the community. And doing this, they compare observed data with simulated data, and this match very closely. And using congruous manner of test to test whether there's a difference between the two distributions, they found no significant difference. So this is the beauty of combining using different aspects of mathematics to be able to explain what we see in reality. And this matches well and replicates what was observed. And this shows that the viral load of a patient and their contact network really determine the cases observed. So mathematical modeling play key role in this current pandemic, and I guess it's going to continue to play key role in different aspects of life and then in future pandemic to occur. And I guess I've been able to show the beauty of mathematics and how we can apply to different infectious disease. So acknowledgements to my postdoctoral supervisor, my collaborator from Monash, Michael from James Cook, and Diana with JC and WHO. And then this is Oye, me, and Anton at Anton's birthday. I guess maybe we'll look for another birthday this year. And then I'd like to thank the Nectar Cloud for allowing me to do this computation for the paper presented in this talk using their cloud system. Thanks to everyone for listening. All right. Back to you, Oye.
Oh, thank you for the wonderful presentation, Adishina. That's good. Again, can you please also hold on with your questions. And at the end of the first presentation by Anton, we're going to ask everyone to ask their respective questions. So, Dr. Fad, are you there? Can you please share your slide and start your presentation? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here at this event. So first of all, it's been great to hear from all the previous presenters from Oye, about the introduction and One Health approach to COVID and epidemiology aspects of it, and from Dr. Gayawan and Adeshina Adekunle. So they presented greatly on the disease mapping and spatial statistics and mathematical modeling and how this can be used in the way of predicting what's going to happen or model what we may think may happen, considering there is a bunch of different assumptions and uncertainties while this pandemic is evolving. So a lot of this, what I'm going to present, which is, oh, sorry, let me share my screen. I haven't been doing that. Is where the economics comes in, and just to touch what lower and middle income countries has been experiencing, why it's of a great concern, especially now that while developed world is kind of trying to get out of the pandemic quite well with a vaccination and bouncing back economically, lowering restrictions and so forth. And where does those emerging economies and lower middle income countries are lacking? So whether we will see more of inequity concerns that are rising currently. So just a bit of okay. My slide switching back and forth now, yeah? Wasn't sure.
Yeah, you're on slide 2. We can see slide
Okay,
2.
good. So just mention about the risks of COVID and why they're quite different in low and lower middle income countries. So first of all, like they have usually a lot of the countries in that category have large populations living in overcrowded conditions. Hence, the social distancing is quite difficult to implement. Then there is, of course, a shortage of clean water, hygiene, and limited supply, and affordability concerns for hand sanitizers for personal and public use. And this kind of translates or relates to what Oyer has been speaking, that how everything is now interconnected, how we live in the environment and core habit with a wildlife and environment around us, which also have an effect on the infectiousness, for example, of different viruses and the spread of diseases. So then there is also a limited healthcare personnel and capacity. This has been greatly observed in many countries. We've seen this vividly now, what's happening in India, for example, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Some of the South Asian countries are getting the second waves as well, or Southeast Asian countries as well. So, which brings us to the problem of testing, treatment, hospital beds for COVID. And hence this, because there has been so much attention to this and the predictions of what COVID can bring in terms of, health burden to the economy, to the country, and cripple the economy as well. So a lot of the countries with limited already resources redirected those healthcare resources from other areas, for example, HIV, TB, pneumonia. We've seen that also quite vividly with international financing, that a lot of the funding has been redirected to the COVID support from other urgent diseases that require resources as well. There is also currently, which is a hotly debated topic, is limited resources for the vaccine procurement, especially for this lower middle income countries and emerging economies. And there has been evidence of limited public administration and public health capacity overall. The mistakes have been made, and new COVID waves that we are currently observing that have negative health, social, and economic consequences. For example, India, which has done quite well, and up until 2 months ago, where they started releasing or removing restrictions on mass gatherings, and they started holding political rallies, which became at the end a super spread event has been shown in the literature quite recently. So all of these risks, even though some of them also of course exists in developing and developed world, they're quite vivid that can exacerbate the situation with COVID in low and lower middle income countries. What we currently have is actually, or what the world worried about this countries is that a kind of double whammy effect, that we have accelerated problems of new cases are coming in, and also a lack of vaccine that these countries are not getting, which brings us to a rising inequity concern that already quite easily seen. So on the graph on the left-hand side, we see a new coronavirus waves that's sweeping through Asia, of course, India, Nepal, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Philippines. Africa, quite surprisingly, has been doing generally quite all right, at least in the statistics. We don't see a rapid spread of new waves and COVID diseases and death. But of course, as the economies are starting to open up, people start to move and migrate and becoming more mobile again, participate in different events and job and employment going back on track. So we may see some of the problems in Africa, Central America, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. On the graph on the right-hand side, we see currently, as of very recently, May 15, the share of people who received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccines, at least what's reported. And Africa, if you can see, is at the very bottom with Asia. So it's quite below the world average, while the Europe developed economies in particular, North America, Israel, for example, at least a third. Recent numbers in the UK also showed, I think, around 40% now that received at least one dose. And we see that countries in the past 2 months, especially in Europe and the US, they vaccinated very rapidly their own population and started to ease those restrictions that Europe and the US have been experiencing. Of course, they've been very hardly hit during the first waves of the pandemic as well. So what were the policy interventions? Generally, even though there have been large heterogeneity policies across the countries, generally what governments implemented very early on, a lot of the governments were implemented very early on, travel restrictions, social distancing requirements, bans on mass gatherings and school closures, and temporary shutdowns of businesses. And that has been happening across both developed and developing nations. Of course, this brings high economic costs and societal burden, especially in those low and lower middle income countries, as they have fragile economies with limited financial resources, limited fiscal space to support the industries. Of course, some of them, they are remittance dependent, which what's been suggested or estimated early on in the pandemic and end of March and April, that the drops in the remittance transfers will be of around 20% for some, up to 20% for some countries. But we will see later on that this scenario actually didn't happen for many of the economies. Also, countries, emerging economies and lower middle income countries, they usually have a weak law protection laws, and unemployment and social protection is very limited. So basically, if a person becomes unemployed, or if the business shuts down, then there is no support for that worker, which of course creates very difficult choice for many governments of what to do if they cannot support their economy, their workers, while they need to close down the economy. And also there is a large gray sector, which also makes it very difficult from public administration point of view to deliver the aid of financial resources to the workers if the government has that support and that capacity to do. Of course, there is also food insecurity, and that problem has been of a bigger concern from international organizations, especially in African countries and Central America in particular. So this economic intervention, economic interventions are required, obviously, to mitigate the crisis and support those in need. So the government, this is just a few slides to show some of the data that we have from the World Bank, that the unemployment protection and social protection is almost non-existent in low middle countries and low income countries, as well as in terms of the regions. Very few countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and East Asia and Pacifics have any of those social safety nets. There, early on in the pandemic, in May and June, there have been a few studies and data collected from Ethiopia, Malawi, Nigeria, and Uganda, where researchers were asking a bunch of questions related to income, and employment, the perception of risks. But here I just wanted to highlight that large proportion of households actually reporting decrease in income across different segments of the economy. Of course, in those countries, farming, agriculture is a big industry, which reported in some countries like Malawi and Nigeria, around 70% people reporting they experienced a decrease in household income, as well as, of course, not surprisingly, the business income across the board has been reporting, households who work in those areas reported a significant decrease in the available income. So we've seen also what I mentioned before is a heterogeneity in economic responses, and that's largely been driven by the available resources and public administration approach of the countries. So some of them, they went to distribute cash handouts and food aid. So we've seen that quite a lot in Southeast Asia, for example, Bangladesh, and some African and Latin American countries doing that. There have been wage support and assistance to firms. This is quite limited because this requires a lot of financial resources, and the countries needs to have quite a large fiscal space, which rarely they do. There has been an increase in social security and employment programs. Those programs largely, well, a lot of them, they've been supported by international organizations such as World Bank and IMF. I'll talk a little bit of that as well, that they provided targeted resources and debt restructuring financing to provide those resources for particular programs, such as to provide the social security and employment support. There have been a lot of industry support and tax relief programs. Those are usually targeted in few countries, in L-LMICs, for example, Thailand and Vietnam. They supported largely the tourism sector and transportation sector. And there's, in addition to those fiscal measures that I've just mentioned, there also have been some monetary policy interventions, such as the easing of the monetary requirements for banks, for example, and reduction in the interest rates. On the graph on the right, what you can see, we've seen also that if we want to compare the advanced economies and emerging economies in low-income countries, we see quite strikingly that the differences are very large. And that's because of the availability of resources that they can have. So, and that concerns both the other sectors or non-health sector and health sector support in terms of the percentages of GDP. So this low and lower middle income countries, they have, again, limited resources, weak infrastructure to deliver aid, because you need usually a good information system. You need investments in those areas to quickly and efficiently deliver the aid. Plus, there are aspects of corruption, of course, which international donors are often concerned about. And there has been a reliance on international aid and donors and expert capacities from those international organizations. So far that the very recent numbers, the World Bank provided over 100, just a highlight, $100 billion in 2020, over 50 billion on grant and concessional terms, and they provided financial vehicles of $12 billion for developing country to purchase vaccines. So those are like concessional loans, most of them. Then, of course, IMF also provided financial assistance over $110 billion, plus debt service relief programs, so that countries could refinance or delay their repayments. And Asian Development Bank also reported a record disbursement for loans, grants, and reliefs of over $23 billion. So there are many other international organizations who also increase their budgets and commitments from the developed economies, contributions to support the lower and middle income countries in the fight with COVID pandemic. But despite this record commitments and disbursements of the funds, more assistance obviously is likely required to help the countries to bounce back with the rest of the world. And that's what we're witnessing now, especially in the bridging the vaccine supply gaps and funding. There's been a lot of media coverage about that. Well, maybe not surprisingly, not much has been happening because of this vaccine nationalism, where the national governments have a first responsibility to their own citizens, and then provide the vaccines to other countries once they vaccinate a large proportion of their own population. So hopefully, as Europe and the United States, where this Pfizer or Moderna, AstraZeneca vaccines are produced, will vaccinate, reach that threshold, they will start, well, that's what has been going on as well. They'll start sharing the vaccines with the rest of the countries and could or make arrangements to build new manufacturing and supply and provide the vaccines to those countries that are currently not having enough. Also, there is a funding concern. There is a COVAX initiative that will fund this program for lower and low middle income countries to a substantial degree. Even though $1.5 billion commitments and pledges been made, there is still funding gap of around $23 billion to provide and supply the vaccines to those countries. So those are the estimates. Again, what I want to mention is like why this is important is because the developed world is what we've witnessed, very surprisingly to many economists, bounce back quite quickly. We are seeing a record growth both in the United States, the UK, what we are projecting in 2021. Australia will be the World Bank just improved the Australian economic forecast as well for this year to around 4 to 5% economic growth. China is growing very rapidly as well, and those countries who actually have the internal capacity to support the industries. And while at the same time, when in low and lower middle income countries, we have that gap, both in vaccines and how quickly those countries can be integrated back to the world economy to a larger degree to support their own economy and relying less on the international donors funding. This was quite interesting. That's been released very recently, I think in March or April by the World Bank. So, which was surprisingly to many to see that remittances flows actually have proven to be quite resilient, and comparing to these early in the pandemic estimations of huge drops in remittances across the board, we've just only seen a 1.6% drop in 2020. Of course, some countries could have been or were more severely affected by the remittances flows. One example can be Fiji, for example, and the Pacific nations, which largely rely on the tourism and remittances. A lot of those workers, they come to Australia and New Zealand from the Pacifics to work there and send money. So because those countries, Australia and New Zealand, have shut their border and went to quite a hard border restrictions, so that has not been happening, obviously. But some of the economies were quite lenient to the migrants and could still provide the work, especially when they're bouncing back now. So this is the last slide, and back to the idea that can we rebound very quickly? The developed economies showed that they seen rapid growth, what I mentioned before, largely to the fiscal and monetary support that countries were able to provide. The global trade is also coming back very quickly. Commodity prices are rising. But the question now will be, I think, for those who are in low and lower middle income countries, can this rebound and reintegration in the world economy quickly happen as well for those economies, low income countries, with the progress of, and this will largely depend, of course, on the vaccination campaigns and how they will continue to fight with COVID. I think that's it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
All right. Thank you so much for the presentation, Anton. That was insightful. Okay, now we can take all questions. Please, if you have any question, you can either type or mute your microphone and ask either any of the presenters the question. Please. The floor is open.
Hi, this is Imran.
Go ahead.
Hello. Am I audible?
Hello, please. Yes, you have. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the nice presentation on this COVID. I would like to add a few points to whatever has been said. You know, the reasons for this COVID rise in India, right? So, in my opinion, what actually happened, because initially the government decided to vaccinate people of the age group of greater than 65. So older people were decided first to be vaccinated. That was the first phase. And they maintained a long gap between phase 1 and phase 2. In phase 2, it was from 45 years to 65 years. So usually in India, those older people, they were usually reluctant in taking the vaccine. So at that point of time, the hospitals were, you can say, having a deserted, they were usually deserted. So most of the people of this age group, they didn't visit the hospitals. Maybe 5% of those or 10% of those persons of that age group visited. So in that, in the third, because there was a long gap between, so they did specify, the time period that, let's suppose in 10 to 15 days, this group will be vaccinated, then for other 15 days for second group. So we lost, good time in that. In the third phase, they announced the vaccine program for all the 18 years to 45 years. So it was a big interval they had, announced for the people, 18 years to 45 years. In fact, in my opinion, they should have separated it from 35 to 45, 25 to 35, and 18 to 25. So it would, it would have avoided the chaos and the shortage of vaccines which we are having now. And moreover, they had enough time to stock the vaccine when the cases were low in the month of January and February. But instead, they exported it to other countries. So this, I think, these are the few things I think could have been managed where we were having low cases, and maybe the maximum of the population could have been vaccinated, and they could have had enough stock for the people of India.
All right.
And rest, whatever you said, the political rallies were there, religious rallies were, which were acted as a super spreader. In fact, just last week, there were, the panchayat elections were going on in one of the state, and some assembly elections in another state. So these things added up.
All right.
Exporting vaccines now?
What happened in my country, which led to the rise of and chaos for the vaccinations now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Any other question? Eric?
I don't know if I have any questions at the moment. I do want to say, thank you all to the wonderful speakers. We heard, different aspects of how statistics can be useful in modeling COVID-19, but also in thinking about the policy implications. And I think that's something that personally I've been thinking a lot more about, is how can statisticians collaborate with the producers of the data and the data decision makers, so the policy makers, to make data-driven decisions. And so I think I was pleased to see all of these different aspects of the of COVID. I'm sure there are many other questions, and so please, if there are more questions, go ahead. I see Thomas has a question in the chat about, is there a minimum number of countries or regions required to conduct such disease mapping models? So maybe that's a question directed for Ezra.
Okay, thank you. The question is if there is a minimum number of regions required for disease mapping model. Well, I think if you have, don't talk of minimum, I don't know, if you talk of regions, once you have regions that are connected, have some boundaries. Of course, if you want to map, you cannot be talking of just a single, maybe entity, a single geographical locations. It has to be a number of them. So I may not be able to give a specific answer on whether a minimum, but the more the number of geographical locations, the better the estimate you are likely to have. Of course, in statistics, generally, if you have few observations and you are working with it, you are likely to have some unstable estimate. Your standard error may be high and things like that. But the more the observation you can have, the better your model. So I would say that the more the number of geographical locations you have, the better you are going to have the estimate. So that is not to say that you cannot map for some few geographical locations if you have that. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, thank you. Saying this is a great eye opener. Thank you. You can, of course, once you read further, if you have any question, feel free to contact. I will, in as much as I can do, I will try to answer. And if I cannot also, these my other colleagues also, they are experts in spatial models, so they can also help out if you have any question. Thank you.
Any further question? All right, I will leave the floor.
Can I just make a quick comment? Yeah. This is what Eric was mentioning about the linkage between data and the decision making, which is we're seeing actually a rapid transformation, especially mostly in the developed world. As the information systems are more developed.
There is some problem with the voice.
Anton, can you check your microphone? I think it's, yeah. I thought it's mine.
Lot of noise in the voice.
Yeah.
Okay, is it better? No, I haven't.
It sounds like maybe it's an internet connection because it's like the robotic.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That we're hearing.
Can you off your video, Anton? Off your video to get a better quality.
Just wanted to mention that it's been a rapid development in this area.
It's not working. Just
I'll just stop talking.
Well,
yeah, just type.
Perhaps you could add your comments into the chat.
Yeah.
You know, I was able to follow some of that you know, Dr. Pak was saying that there are rapid developments in this area of making data-driven decisions, and I guess the idea is that that now data is available to decision makers in a way that wasn't in the past. Maybe that might be the, yeah, I might be adding words into to Dr. Pak's thoughts. So tracktherecovery.org.
All right. Yeah.
It looks like a site for data about these policy issues. So thank you for sending that. I guess this is just in the United States, but that, yeah, that I think that is, well, I mean, we know that this global pandemic, you know, has had I don't even have the right vocabulary for this, but that there have been disparate impacts on the pandemic in terms of, you know, countries impacted, in terms of race and gender and you know, people's occupations, and it's likely that will also be the case for the recovery, and that the hardest hit will be the slowest to recover, you know. And so, you know, I guess a different way to say this is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so hopefully we can track the recovery, but we can also use data, you know, yeah, to highlight inequalities, but also just to use data in general to make better decisions. And so just, one short example is that at CLEDA, it's the Center for African Education in Abuja in Nigeria. They conducted a study on the impacts of COVID-19 on small businesses in the area in northern Nigeria. And so hopefully, studies like that will be able to lead to better decision making and faster recoveries. Yeah, and that's just my thoughts on this. So sending it back to Professor Adegboye for closing remarks.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to actually contribute to this symposium. And it has been a wonderful collaboration with Ezra and Additional. And I hope everyone participating at the symposium, if you have any question, I will share the slides presented today with you. And if anyone is interested, they can get it through the network. And we are all open for collaboration at any time. So the door is open for such. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And yeah, just to reiterate, if you could send me the PDF of your slides, I will post them on the LISA 2020 website. And there should be a recap of this session in the LISA 2020 newsletter, which will come out next Monday, the weekly newsletter. But again, thank you to all, and to Dr. Ezra for organizing, and to Dr. Adegboye for chairing, and for the other speakers. It was a wonderful session, and it was a great way to end this year's iteration, this long iteration of the LISA 2020 symposium. The next events for the LISA 2020 will be in conjunction with the ISI's World Statistics Congress. So the International Statistical Institute has a biannual, every other year, World Statistics Congress, and we have several LISA 2020 network sponsored or organized symposia events for that. But until next time, thanks everybody for joining. I hope everybody stays safe, and when the vaccine becomes available, that you take it, and that we can all have a very fast recovery from COVID-19. Bye, everyone.